Hey everyone, Dr. Adriana Popescu here with you today to talk about the difference between survival and thrival. So as a psychologist and an addiction and trauma specialist, I work a lot with folks who are, what I would say, kind of stuck in survival mode. So I want to talk a little bit today about what that means, what the process of healing from trauma looks like, and to just give you hopefully a sense of the name of my book, What If You're Not As Fucked Up As You Think You Are? Because I think a lot of people who have gone through traumatic experiences end up feeling like there's something wrong with them, or not really understanding, like, why can't I get over this? Why can't I just like move on? And they may be getting messages like that from other people, like, get over it. It's like, it's in the past, move on. But I don't think people fully understand the impact that experiencing a traumatic event or multiple traumatic events can really have on your body, your mind, your emotions, and your spirit. So I want to share with you a little bit today about my own experience and what I've learned in working with people for many, many years with these issues. So what is trauma? Trauma is basically subjective, right? You and I could go through the same experience and have totally different reactions to it. So it's really not about what happened to you. It's about how you respond to what happens to you. And when people experience a traumatic event that overwhelms their ability to cope in the moment, that's when it's likely to have a more negative impact. In the last few years, we've seen, for example, a lot of natural disasters. I live in California. We've had a lot of fires. More recently, we've had some flooding. And it's been really interesting to see people's different responses. I've had clients and worked with folks who lost their homes, lost everything in a fire, and other folks who had the same experience, but they're in radically different places. And so I think a lot of how we experience this is based on how we interpret the event that happened to us. If people look at this experience as this horrible thing happened to me, I'm powerless, I'm a victim of some sort. We call this like a victim mentality or a victim consciousness. When people are functioning from that place, it tends to leave scars. It tends to leave you kind of stuck in the experience in some kind of way, where when people are able to reframe how they're seeing the experience, and this might not be able to be possible in the beginning. A lot of times this is something that's going to come later, and you may even need to do some work on the trauma to be able to get to this place. But this idea of post-traumatic growth, when you're able to look back on something horrible that you experienced through a more positive lens, through the perspective of, yeah, I survived that experience, but I'm not going to let it continue to affect me in a really debilitating kind of way. I'm going to grow from it. I'm going to learn from it. And I'm going to use it as an experience to, create a different future for myself. Okay. And that's not easy to get to, particularly if you're somebody who has experienced a lot of trauma. So I work as a clinical director in a drug and alcohol rehab for women who have experienced addiction and trauma. And for them, they have something called, most of them have something called chronic PTSD, where you have post-traumatic stress disorder that is coming not from a single event, like a car accident or natural disaster or an assault of some sort, but it's actually a series of events. And especially when these things happen in early childhood, it really can leave a lasting impression. It'll affect the way your nervous system, we know this from kids now from the research. I've talked, before in videos about that adverse childhood experiences study where they looked at kids who had early life adverse experiences, what we might call traumas. They might have experienced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect. They may have experienced someone in the home who was mentally ill or addicted, alcoholic, someone who went to prison, different things like that, witnessing domestic violence, maybe in the homes, things like that can make a lasting impression. And if it, what experiencing these, especially unexpected events, most of the time you're not, I've been in 5 pretty bad car accidents, and I never saw them coming, any of them. So part of it is the sort of shock element, right? Out of nowhere, seemingly, a catastrophic thing has occurred. And so your body will activate its fight, flight, freeze response, because that's what it does. It's a survival mechanism. It's meant to protect you. It's meant to help you survive if you should be faced with a predator or with some sort of overwhelming event. There's a series of biochemical responses that will happen in your body to try to protect it and keep you alive. The most basic of which is the freeze response. That is the shutdown. So what happens when you're in a freeze response is your body basically shuts down. Your heart rate, your blood pressure, everything slows down. You might get cold. You often, the areas of the brain that are impacted include Broca's area, which is your ability to speak. I've shared before that my first car accident I was in when I was a 9-year-old, we got hit from behind at very high speed when we were parked. And I remember the experience of being in shock. In fact, they used to call PTSD shell shock before we had that term, post-traumatic stress disorder. We used to call it shell shock. And we mostly were referring to it with war veterans, that these men would go off to war and come back traumatized from the horrible things they had witnessed and experienced. And they would have something called shell shock, which is really, I think, that state of freeze, that state of shutdown. I remember being in the ambulance and I couldn't speak and I didn't feel like I was in my body and I couldn't feel anything in my body. Like I have the sense that I was injured. I knew something was off with my back and yet I couldn't feel it. So in that moment, my body was trying to numb things so that I could survive. So I didn't have to feel the pain. Now, the problem with all of this comes when the effects of that linger. So in the animal world, if an animal goes through, like being chased by a predator and it gets away, it'll do things like shake afterwards, and it'll like release all of that energy, the amp up of the fight flight response, which is the opposite of freeze. It's really like your adrenaline's going, you got a lot of cortisol in your system, the blood flow is going to your extremities, so you can either fight or run. Your pupils are dilated. That's where everything is kind of sped up, again, as a survival mechanism to help you get away from whatever the danger is. So the issue, with humans, for whatever reason, is that sometimes we get stuck, and it can happen to animals too. I mean, if you've ever adopted, for example, a pet, like I have always adopted my cats. I definitely have had cats you could tell had experienced something traumatic and were still in this fear state, where they were afraid perhaps to be touched, right? Because maybe they were hit in the past, things like that. So it's not just humans who experience this. Animals can too, but animals also don't have a sense of self. The thing that happens for humans is not only can your nervous system be potentially permanently altered by this experience, especially if it's a series of traumatic events. And like I was saying with the adverse childhood experiences, what they found was that children who'd had multiple traumatic or stressful adverse experiences, their brains developed in a way that it's almost like they're overly sensitive, and their fight, flight, freeze mechanism activates really quickly to things that are not actually life or death situations. So the amygdala that's processing the incoming information is basically saying danger, danger, danger. There's tigers and bears and danger everywhere. And so we need to be on this constant state of hypervigilance, or it's not even safe to be in our bodies and we need to be shut down and dissociated and out here somewhere. Okay. So this is kind of what we're dealing with. So when people come to see me, for therapy, because they're still kind of stuck in that, or they may not even realize they're still stuck in that. They just know that they have a lot of stress. They have a lot of anxiety. They find themselves maybe wanting to self-medicate with food, with drugs, with alcohol, because those things do give you sort of a temporary reprieve from, that intensity, because some of them are depressants. They calm your nervous system down, right? Take a Valium. That's what the doctor might even give you, to help you with that intense fight flight response. But those things are just band-aids. Those things are not really healing you at the level of the trauma. And the thing is that that trauma gets locked in the body. We know from people like Dr. Besser van der Kolk and Dr. Peter Levine, the body keeps the score. So we have that trauma locked in our bodies, and we may not even realize that it's there. And we might dissociate from certain parts of our body. We might not even be like, we might be in our heads, but not like really present with like the lower parts of our body. Or if, you know, an injury happened to a certain area, you might not have a lot of sensation there. You might have some numbing. I have a lot of clients who've experienced sexual abuse who don't really feel pleasure in that part of their body, you know, because of what happened, right? Because there was an association with, you know, that something happened against my will that I didn't want to have happen. So you might just dissociate from that part of your body completely. The good news is that all of this can be healed. Traditional talk therapy often is not enough. It's interesting. I was just having a conversation with someone looking at an office space. We were talking about therapy and how, you know, he had been in therapy for years and was kind of over it because, you know, and I said, yeah, especially if you're dealing with trauma, just telling your trauma story over and over again doesn't really get to the energy of it that's actually locked in your body, which is why these somatic and energetic, holistic kinds of approaches that are bringing in East and West, bringing in traditional healing methods with modern day science, these methods seem to be the most effective for actually getting to those stuck energies in the body and extinguishing the trauma responses. So what does that mean, to extinguish a trauma response? Meaning you've been conditioned that, for example, every time you hear a certain noise or certain tone of voice, like let's say you were a kid who got yelled at, or there was, again, like the domestic violence in your home, every time you hear perhaps like a man's angry voice, that might activate that startle response. You might inadvertently go into a fight, flight, freeze response. So these holistic techniques, things like EMDR, brain spotting, EFT, emotional freedom techniques, a lot of techniques from energy psychology, Reiki, access consciousness. There's different energy techniques that we can use to essentially calm the nervous system and let the body know, actually, we're safe. This is not our abuser. It's just someone else who's yelling. We don't have to shut down. We don't have to get into fight, flight. We're safe and we're okay. And these methods do work to actually create a shift in the brain functioning, to create a biochemical shift where like the stress hormones come down and your feel good chemicals kick in. There's a whole branch of psychology looking at polyvagal theory, like how the nervous system is, you know, has this more ancient part, the dorsal vagus nerve, and then this more modern ventral vagal nerve, and how like one, it really represents safety and a calm nervous system, and the other one is an activated unsafe nervous system. And how do we, different techniques that people are learning around how do we get the body feeling safe. So that's really like, you know, in the beginning part. I mean, in the beginning, you might even just need to acknowledge there was a trauma, right? Let's acknowledge what happened and the impact that it has had. Let's not minimize. Let's not get to the space of, oh yeah, just get over it. Let's acknowledge that something really potentially profound has occurred and it has had an impact on you in every way possible, potentially. Let's acknowledge that. Then let's look at, okay, what are the conditioned responses? What triggers your trauma responses? And what do you experience when that trigger occurs? So with my car accident, one of my car accidents, I remember every time I would drive on the freeway past that spot where the accident occurred, even if I wasn't conscious of it, I would find myself getting stiff. My breath would get really shallow. I'd get that response. And so I had to use the techniques to be able to extinguish that response, that learned response, because I didn't used to respond to that freeway that way. I didn't used to feel nervous getting in the car and driving, right? But I did afterwards. So then we want to work with extinguishing trauma responses. And that's more of, you know, that's a lot of that is a body-based kind of thing. And then we got to work with the mental part and the emotional part, right? You might have fear stuck in your body. You might have shame, right? If you've experienced abuse of some sort, you might feel broken, defective, dirty, damaged goods, something like that. And so we have to then start working with those energies, the beliefs that came from having the trauma. Lots of people have survivor guilt. Like, why did someone else die or have such severe consequences and I didn't? Or, maybe it was my fault. It was my fault that this happened to me. Even it's often irrational. Like, how could it have been your fault that maybe someone else chose to end their life, right? But yet people will go into a lot of shame and blame and guilt. So oftentimes we need to sort through those emotions and like process them, because the thing with trauma is when you are overwhelmed with it and can't deal with it, all the emotions, all the energy of it gets locked away. And Peter Levine talks about a trauma capsule, which is kind of like, it's not like it's a physical thing, but it's basically a way in which we repress material we can't deal, and we lock it away somewhere in our subconscious, in our body. It's like, I can't deal with it, I'm going to put it over here, but it's still impacting you, right? It's like a slow, toxic effect where it's still affecting your nervous system, coloring the way you see yourself, giving you a sense of, I'm not safe in the world. I can't protect myself. I'm powerless against these things that happen to me. So now, once we get a sense of, controlling and getting a grip on the trauma responses, then we have to work with the beliefs that came from the trauma and any emotions that are still held, which would cause us to, for example, be fearful of certain things now. Like, I'm afraid to drive a car now, or I'm afraid to go out at night because something bad happened, whatever it may be. So then we work with that stuff, and we use the same tools. We might use them a little differently. And then we want to look at, okay, so now we start to get out of victim consciousness. Now maybe we're starting to move into from survival into thrival. Now we need to look at, okay, well, what else do I need to shift in my mind, in my emotions, in my behavior that would allow me to now move from a place of surviving into thriving? So we may need to look at things like relationships, healing the relationship you have with yourself, healing the relationship you have with others. Because one thing that I see over and over again with people who have experienced trauma is that because they often don't feel safe, or because their trust with someone was broken, they don't feel like they can open up to people. They might have a wall around their heart, right? They might isolate themselves. A lot of people will lose contact with friends and loved ones that they used to enjoy doing stuff with. They might hide out in their house, and not feel like they can be social. So we need to work on that. And how do we create healthy relationships? If you have a lifetime's worth of abusive relationships, how to you that's become normal? How do you move past what seems normal with the chaos and the disruption? And maybe you're with a narcissist or a gaslighter. How do we break those patterns? Because law of attraction will say, if you believe that that's what you deserve, or that is the energy you're kind of putting out in the world, you're going to just keep attracting relationship after relationship or situation after situation that's going to probably re-traumatize you, or at least validate your distorted point of view that you deserve it, that you're broken, that you're damaged goods, whatever. And then we definitely have to work with the toxic shame that comes from all of that to allow people to actually start to form healthy relationships, non-abusive relationships with others. And then, of course, to stop abusing themselves if they're doing addictive behaviors or self-harm or whatever it may be, that they're doing that to themselves. So it's a process. It is not a quick, easy process, though I certainly have seen miracles occur. And I say, let's never rule out the, instantaneous moment, an aha, a profound opening, a spiritual experience even, because what I've also seen through traumatic events, as well as things I've experienced, like being really sick, like being so ill that I could barely function, and doctors not knowing what was wrong with me when I was in my 20s. And like that was a dark night of the soul going through that. And the bad car accident, one of the bad car accidents happened during that time. And I was in a relationship that was somewhat abusive and all these things. were happening at once, that kind of put me in a space of spiritual awakening and trying to make sense of like the meaning of everything and why was all this happening and what was my part in the creation of all of this, not from a blaming myself place, but from how can I empower myself to break these patterns so I don't keep doing this again and again. And so having a spiritual awakening was really part of this journey for me. And it also can be part of moving from survival to thrival. And I love the name of my trauma healing center, Firebird Healing. This is the mythical phoenix bird, right? The story of the phoenix bird is that, it rises from the ashes and the rubble of like everything that is burned down. And I just love that symbol because I think that's what I know is possible. That's what I have done. I have healed myself of my traumas. I have healed myself of my chronic fatigue syndrome and Lyme disease. And, I'm like a bird soaring now. And I want to, facilitate that process for other people who want that same experience. And so at Firebird Healing, we're doing individual therapy using these modalities that have been, the research has shown that these modalities have been super effective. I mean, study after study where, after 3, 6, 10 sessions, sometimes even a single session of EMDR, brain spotting, EFT tapping, or any number of other techniques, people are no longer meeting those symptoms of PTSD. They're getting desensitized to their trauma to where, yeah, that was a really awful car accident, but I can drive past it on the freeway. I'm not scared of driving anymore. I don't have that nervous system activation when I think about it. We can heal, and then we can move from this mentality of I am a victim of these horrible things to no, I'm a survivor. Like even people who've been through like cancer, how many people talk about, being a survivor? Well, I'd like to move that conversation to how can I be a thriver? Not just that I survived this and I'm still like white knuckling it in, survival mode, but more like I'm that phoenix bird, like beautiful bird flapping my wings, like soaring. That's my vision. And I know that it's possible if you're willing to do the work. I'm not saying the work is easy. And like I said, it is a process, but it certainly is possible. So part of why I wanted to have this conversation is because I'm going to be actually facilitating a 4-week workshop starting, I believe, March 13th. It's going to be online for 90-minute sessions where I'm basically going to take people through this process I kind of outlined, like talking about the stages of healing from trauma. How do we self-care for ourselves? Extinguishing those nervous system trauma responses, shifting the victim consciousness, and healing the relationship with ourselves and others, having healthy relationships. And so to really make that transition from one to the other. Who is this for? I mean, originally when I visioned this, it was for the clients that I was working with who had done a significant amount or a fair amount of work on the trauma. And now we're sort of in this space of, well, now what? Now what do I do with my life? So I don't know if this is for someone who's acutely in the midst of something traumatic, because you might not be yet in a space where you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. You'll know for yourself. But if this is appealing to you and you're thinking, oh, there might be something in this for me, and you have questions, by all means, DM me here through Facebook or shoot me an email through at firebirdhealing.com or my website, adrianapopescu.org. There's lots of ways. I'm easily reachable. But I really see this as my contribution to folks, to give them hope, to let them know that you can in fact triumph over your trauma. You do not have to be held hostage by it. You do not have to stay stuck in it. And you certainly do not need to give it the power to destroy your life any longer if that's what you've been doing. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. We'd love to see you in the workshop. And otherwise, I'll see you next time.